Okay, so welcome to this quick tutorial video about how to put the right settings into VCarve so that you can use the Big Blue or the Big Red CNC machine. So I've opened up VCarve 11 here. I'm going to go ahead and create a new file. When you create your file, you need to go ahead and make sure that the job setup settings are correct. So first of all, most of the time for you people who are just starting out, you're going to use a single-sided job type. This doesn't cover double-sided or rotary. You need to set your job size to be the size of your workpiece. So if your workpiece is 15 inches wide by 10 inches tall, go ahead and set those settings accordingly. The key one is, though, that the thickness is accurate. So 3/4 inch plywood is not always 3/4 of an inch thick. Neither is 1/2 inch, neither is 1/4 inch. If you buy 1/2 inch acrylic, though, chances are it's probably 1/2 an inch thick. But what you should do, especially if you're going to be cutting all the way through your material, is get a set of calipers, whether one you own or a set that is in one of the makerspaces, and measure the thickness of your piece. Put the actual measurement into this thickness area. Don't just assume it says 3/4 plywood that it's 3/4. Put the right measurement in there. Next, your Z0 position is going to be material surface. Machine bed is a advanced function, so don't use that for now. Go ahead and use material surface. Last but not least, your XY0 position. So 9 times out of 10, your XY0 position is going to be the bottom left corner. Why is that? Because that's custom and practice in the CNC world for most projects. If you wanted to use any other position, you might use the middle. And that's for a project where you, for instance, have a sign where you only want to engrave in the piece of material you have on the bed. You don't actually want to cut anything out, and you want to make sure that the engraving gets as close to dead center on your piece of material as is possible. So in that case, you might set the XY0 position to be the center of your workpiece, and just make sure that when you set up the CNC machine that you also set the XY0 in your machine setup to the center of your workpiece. For now, I'm going to use the bottom left corner. So once you've got those settings set, go ahead and hit OK. Now, for the purposes of this video, it doesn't really matter what my drawing is. I'm just going to draw a rectangle in the piece in the middle of my material. I'm going to hit close, and I'm going to go ahead and just create one pocket tool path real quick. I'm going to use a 1/4 inch end mill. I'm going to cut 1/4 of an inch into my piece. I'm going to hit calculate. Now you can deal with all the other stuff like which end mill it is, all those other settings, you know, spindle speed, feed rate, number of passes, climber, conventional, etc. separately. But for the purposes of this, I'm just going to hit calculate. So let's pretend we've just gone ahead and got all of the tool paths in place that we want to do. So first thing to do in VCarve is make sure that you run a preview all tool paths. That's going to tell you that you've got it in the right position, that you're happy with where it looks, you know, that everything's cut out right, that you didn't go outside of your material, etc. Great. So now we've previewed it, and I'm happy that it looks like what it is I want to cut. Next thing I'm going to do, close. I'm going to go to material setup. Now this is quite important. Your thickness should come over from your project setup, as should your XY datum position and your Z0 position. Those should all be set in the job setup that we did earlier. Model position in material, just leave it where it is. Gap above material, 0 inches. There are some examples, especially for 3D carving, where you might change this. Again, but for novices starting out, you're not going to need to change this at all. Now, the most important one of all are the rapid Z-gaps above material and the home start position. So when you're cutting is called a controlled move. That's not a rapid move, it's a controlled move. So when it's actually carving out the center of this piece, it's going to be controlled. When it's rapid is when it lifts itself up and either starts the cut or when it leaves the cut at the end of the project. So you absolutely need to make sure that your clearance height, in other words, the height of the end mill will reach when it's moving fast around the table, is higher than the highest thing you have. If you're on Big Red and you have clamps being used to hold your work surface or your work material down, your Z-gap clearance above material needs to be the height above your material and then another 1/4 of an inch at least above the clamps. So in other words, if you have your work surface is set at basically 0 and the clamp sticks up 1.5 inches above your work surface material, your rapid Z-gap clearance height needs to be at least 1.75. And what that means is that when the machine moves around, it's not going to run into one of your clamps and take a chunk out of it. If you see the clamps that are on the Big Red machine in Leesburg, you'll see some cuts that have happened into those clamps from people not setting their Z-gap high enough. So the second setting you need to worry about is the home or start position. So in other words, at the very beginning of the cut, even if the machine is over here way off the top of your material somewhere, it's going to return to 0, 0 before it goes over and starts cutting the pocket. So if you want your home start position to be 0, 0, that's fine. Most people leave it there. But you absolutely need to make sure that the Z-gap above material is at least whatever your clearance Z1 height is over here. So if this is 1.75, this also needs to be 1.75. If you're using the Big Blue machine in Purcellville and there is nothing on the table that is higher than the piece you're about to cut, in that case, you can set your Z clearance gap a lot lower. I usually use about 0.2 because in that case, because there's nothing above the surface that I'm going to cut, I'm not worried about my end mill hitting something that I don't want it to hit. So I'll set my Z gap clearance to 0.2, and I'll set my Z gap above material at my home position to 0.2 as well. So then you go ahead and hit OK. If you change the machine material setup, it is going to say, hey, we have to recalculate all of the tool paths. That's fine. Just recalculate now. Brilliant. Last thing I like to check before I go to export my G-code, I go back into every one of my tool paths, double click it, and then depending on the number of end mills that are used in that tool path, I will go ahead and click one and hit edit. And what I'm looking for is to make sure that my spindle speed and my feed rate are right. So here's an example of where they're not. For most projects, again, you can change these later, but for most projects, a 1/4 inch end mill, you're going to be spinning at about 12,000 RPM, and you're going to be moving at between 80 and 100 inches per minute. And your plunge rate, how fast the end mill will move into the material when it starts cutting, usually at least 20, sometimes I'll set it at 30. So you want to go back and check each one of your tool paths and make sure that the feeds and speeds rates are set correctly. Hit OK. I'll also check over here to make sure that it's doing the correct number of passes. So in other words, you don't want your pass depth to be any more than the radius of your end mill, which is also the same thing as half of the diameter of your end mill. So if your end mill is a 1/4 inch wide or round, if you like, if the diameter of your end mill is a 1/4 of an inch, you don't want to go more than 1/8 of an inch at a pass, at least when you're starting out. That'll save you keeping the life of your tool as long as you can, but also reducing the risk that you break the tool over time. So again, with a 1/4 inch end mill, we're cutting much less than 1/8 of an inch at a time, so that's fine. We hit OK and hit close. So now we're at the point where we're ready to go ahead and export our G-code. So if you're working from home, you'll go ahead and save your file as a .crv file. You'll go ahead and take it over to either the computer in the green room in Purcellville or the computer next to Big Red in Leesburg. And you'll go ahead and come over here and go save toolpath, and then your options will be available. You'll pick your correct post processor. I don't have the right ones because I'm showing this from my home machine, and then you'll be able to save the toolpath. The only thing you can't do at home on our Makersmiths version of VCarve is actually export the G-code, but you can do all the other checks ahead of time. Hope that video is helpful. That should get you ready. That will hopefully reduce a little bit of the anxiety that you have when you set up to export your G-code and before you hit run on one of the machines.